Ever had to confront someone older than you and stand your ground?
Imagine receiving a video from your uncle that was clearly intended for someone else, only to discover your own father in it, the very man who had guided you through childhood scrapes and school milestones. Laughing heartily with his longtime friends around a crackling fire pit in the backyard, casually dismissing you as a useless waste of space who had squandered every chance he believed he had provided. His words carrying the weight of years of unspoken resentments while the others joined in, with nods and chuckles that echoed like distant thunder, leaving you frozen in place with your phone clutched tightly in your hand as your heart raced with a mix of shock and betrayal, because right in the midst of that painful revelation, his phone interrupted the moment with a call from the bank, their representative's voice cutting through the air with professional insistence about his overdue mortgage payment and the accumulating interest that threatened to upend his fragile stability, all of which you overheard by sheer accident since the video had been playing on speaker, compelling you to remain utterly silent in that initial stunned moment while a quiet storm began brewing inside, prompting questions about the true depth of those familial bonds and the hidden fractures that had long simmered beneath the surface of everyday interactions. That ordinary Tuesday evening unfolded in my modest kitchen in Dayton, Ohio, where I had settled after a long day at the insurance office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold on the counter. The steam long dissipated as I mindlessly scrolled through messages on my phone while ensuring my daughter Sarah was tucked safely into bed down the hall, her soft breathing a comforting rhythm against the quiet hum of the refrigerator. And it was then that Uncle Mike, my dad's perpetually disorganized older brother known for his endearing yet chaotic attempts at staying connected with the family, sent over that unexpected video attachment in a text message accompanied by what I assumed was his typical enthusiastic thumbs up, figuring it must be another lighthearted clip from one of his weekend fishing outings where he would inevitably celebrate even the smallest catch with over-the-top exuberance, so without hesitation or suspicion, I pressed play expecting a momentary distraction to ease the fatigue of single parenthood and the relentless grind of balancing work with raising a curious 10-year-old who asked endless questions about everything from history to the stars. Instead, the footage that emerged from my screen transported me straight into a backyard gathering under the warm glow of string lights strung across the patio, where my father, Robert Harper, sat in his familiar worn lawn chair surrounded by a few of his retired colleagues from the old auto plant, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames of the fire pit as they passed around bottles of beer and shared stories that carried the easy camaraderie of men who had weathered decades of economic ups and downs together. But the conversation took a sharp and personal turn when Dad launched into his commentary about me, his only daughter Emily, the one who had left home at 18 to chase ambitions he had always labeled as unrealistic daydreams, describing me with that booming laugh of his as nothing more than a useless waste of space who had floated through life without grasping the opportunities he claimed to have laid at my feet, his words laced with a bitterness that surprised me not in its existence, but in its raw delivery, amplified by the approving murmurs and knee slaps from his companions that made the whole scene feel like a private roast turned public execution, forcing me to pause the video and replay segments just to confirm that I had not misinterpreted the casual venom directed at the very person who had sent him birthday cards and holiday checks without fail for years, the betrayal sinking in deeper with each repetition as I sat there alone in the dim light, my reflection staring back from the darkened window like an unwelcome intruder in my own home. The emotional weight pressed down heavily, stirring memories of those formative years in our sagging ranch-style house on the outskirts of town, where Dad's lectures on hard work and self-reliance had often come across as dismissive judgments rather than supportive guidance, especially during my struggles with community college and the early days of my marriage that ended in divorce, leaving me to rebuild independently while he retreated further into his routines of retirement hobbies and occasional bar outings. Yet despite the sting, I refrained from immediate tears or outbursts because Sarah's presence nearby demanded composure, opting instead to let the hurt ferment into a calculated calm that hinted at the possibility of addressing this in a way that would resonate on his level without descending into chaos. Just as I contemplated deleting the file to bury The incident, like so many family disagreements before it, my phone vibrated insistently with an incoming call from an unrecognized number, and in my distracted state with the text thread still active, it connected automatically on speaker mode. Filling the kitchen with the measured tone of a bank representative from First National Mortgage who addressed Dad directly about the payment that was now several days past due, outlining the penalties and urging him to contact them immediately to discuss hardship options, her voice steady and procedural against the backdrop of what must have been his flustered response on the other end, though the call dropped shortly after without resolution, leaving me to absorb the dual blow of emotional rejection and financial vulnerability that painted a picture of a man far more precarious than his tough exterior suggested. In that ensuing silence, broken only by the distant tick of the wall clock, I chose not to intervene or reach out right away, allowing the information to settle as I moved through the motions of locking up for the night and preparing for bed. But lying awake with the ceiling fan whirring overhead, my mind raced with scenarios of confrontation and consequence, ultimately leading me to delay the mailing of a check I had promised for his persistent roof repairs, the one he had mentioned in passing during our last call as if it were my ongoing duty to maintain the home he refused to leave, tucking the envelope instead into my glove compartment the following morning, where it would linger as a subtle reminder of the power shift occurring beneath our interactions. As I drove to work past his neighborhood, catching a fleeting view of his battered truck parked crookedly in the driveway with a new dent marring the fender that spoke to recent carelessness, a spark of resolve ignited within me, urging me to explore the layers of this revelation further, particularly with the bank's pressure adding urgency to his facade of independence. And it was during this contemplative commute that I recalled an overlooked photograph from my high school graduation tucked away in a dusty album on the shelf at home, one capturing Dad's strained smile beside Mom's more genuine one with an indistinct figure lurking in the shadowed background, a subtle clue that suggested deeper family histories waiting to be unearthed, pulling me toward an inevitable unraveling that promised both confrontation and unforeseen discoveries. Deciding to visit Dad the following Saturday morning carried with it a weight of unresolved tension that made the drive from my apartment in Dayton feel longer than the usual 40 minutes through the rolling Ohio farmlands dotted with silos and faded campaign signs from elections long past, my hands gripping the steering wheel a bit tighter than necessary as I replayed the video's cruel words in my head, while Sarah dozed in the passenger seat with her backpack clutched like a security blanket, the radio murmuring softly about local gas prices climbing again in a way that mirrored the rising pressure in our family dynamics, without anyone willing to acknowledge the leaks just yet. I had convinced myself that this trip was merely a routine check, and combined with delivering that long-delayed check for his roof repairs, the one I had composed with deliberate slowness over the past few days to let the sting of his betrayal simmer without alerting him to my knowledge, yet beneath that practical excuse lay a deeper intent to probe gently into his circumstances, perhaps drawing out an explanation for the financial call I had overheard, or even an unwitting apology for the mockery that had exposed cracks in the foundation of our already strained relationship, all while maintaining the facade of the dutiful daughter who showed up unannounced with baked goods from the corner bakery to soften the edges of any potential confrontation. Pulling into the gravel driveway of the old ranch house where I had spent my childhood navigating creaky floorboards and Dad's booming voice echoing from the garage, I noted immediately how the property seemed to reflect his hidden struggles with patches of overgrown weeds encroaching on the flower beds Mom had once tended so meticulously before her illness took her away 5 years earlier, the mailbox overflowing with envelopes that could easily be mistaken for junk mail but likely carried more ominous contents given the bank's recent persistence. And as I stepped out with Sarah trailing behind, her curiosity piqued by the familiar yet changed landscape, Dad emerged from the front door in his standard flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows, his calloused hands wiping on a rag that smelled faintly of oil even from a distance, greeting us with a bear hug that enveloped me in the comforting yet confining scent of his world, one built on manual labor and unspoken expectations that had shaped so much of my independence as a reaction against it. We moved inside to the living room where the furniture sagged under years of use, and the air held a mix of stale coffee and newsprint from the stack of unread papers on the side table. Settling into our roles with me on the couch handing over the check, as if the delay had been nothing more than a busy schedule at the office, while Dad pocketed it with a grunt of approval and launched into tales of his latest fishing excursion with Uncle Mike, describing in vivid detail how they had hauled in a stringer full of perch that morning under a sky-threatening rain, his enthusiasm painting pictures of simpler escapes from the daily grind that I envied even as it masked the realities pressing in around him. Conversation meandered naturally from there to lighter topics like Sarah's upcoming school play, where she would portray a young inventor much like the Wright brothers who had once soared from these very fields, her excitement bubbling over as she demonstrated a makeshift propeller from construction paper. But I steered us subtly toward more personal waters by inquiring about his retirement routines and how he was managing the fixed income in an economy where everything from utilities to groceries seemed to conspire against folks like him, watching closely as his posture stiffened ever so slightly and his eyes darted to the window overlooking the backyard where the fire pit from the video stood silent sentinel. He deflected with characteristic bluster, joking about the banks being nosier than neighborhood gossips and assuring me that any hiccups with the house payments were temporary glitches easily sorted by a savvy with online banking, though the way his fingers drummed on the armrest betrayed a nervousness that aligned all too well with the overheard call, prompting me to nod sympathetically while inside I cataloged the inconsistencies between his proud declarations and the vulnerability I had glimpsed through that accidental window into his life. Lunch came together in the kitchen with simple turkey sandwiches assembled on paper plates using the mustard he always insisted was the only brand worth buying from the discount aisle. The meal accompanied by Sarah's animated recounting of her soccer team's latest victory that drew reluctant smiles from Dad as he passed the chips, creating a brief illusion of normalcy that almost made me forget the undercurrent of resentment fueling my visit, until she excused herself to explore the backyard in search of early fireflies despite the midday sun, leaving us alone with the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall and the opportunity for deeper dialogue that I seized by asking outright if the roof work had progressed or if finances were tying his hands more than he let on. His response came laced with evasion, a story about waiting on a neighbor's recommendation for a reliable contractor while avoiding direct answers about money, the humor emerging unexpectedly when he pulled out his checkbook to illustrate a point about budgeting only to realize he had left it in the truck cab, prompting a comical shuffle to retrieve it during which he nearly tripped over Sarah's abandoned backpack, turning the moment into one of those awkward family laughs that bridged discomfort without resolving it. Yet as we wrapped up the visit with hugs on the porch and vague plans for a Sunday dinner to include Mike, I caught sight through the window of his cherished fishing trophy gleaming on the mantel, the one he had won in a tournament back in the 80s and polished religiously as a symbol of better days, and in a flash of impulsive retribution for the video's barbs, as he stepped away briefly to fetch a forgotten jacket from the hall closet, I nudged my travel mug just enough on the side table to send a cascade of dark coffee spilling across the trophy's base in a deliberate accident that stained the wood slowly and would require scrubbing to restore, a petty yet satisfying act of payback, disguised as clumsiness that brought a secret thrill amid the growing uncertainty of how far this path of subtle vengeance might lead. Departing with waves from Sarah in the rearview mirror, the road ahead stretching under a sky now heavy with clouds that mirrored my swirling thoughts, I felt a tentative empowerment mixed with doubt about the wisdom of these small strikes against the man who had after all raised me through tougher times, but that sense of poised conflict shattered moments later, when my phone illuminated the dashboard with an incoming call from Uncle Mike, his voice emerging hesitant and laced with regret over the connection as he admitted that the videos dispatched to me had not been entirely a mistake, but rather a calculated slip intended to force some long-overdue family reckoning. His words trailing off into implications of deeper motives that left me accelerating into the gathering dusk with questions multiplying faster than the miles behind me. Uncle Mike's confession over the phone that Saturday evening lingered in my thoughts like an unwelcome fog rolling in from the Great Lakes, transforming the drive home from Dad's into a labyrinth of doubts and determinations as I navigated the twilight highways back to Dayton with Sarah humming along to a playlist of her favorite pop tunes that did little to dispel the undercurrent of unease, settling in my chest, prompting me to pull over at a roadside diner just off the interstate for a quick bite of greasy fries and coffee that tasted more of regret than refreshment while I replayed his words about the video being a deliberate nudge toward family truth. His voice cracking with the weight of years spent mediating between Dad's stubborn pride and the rest of us who had learned to tiptoe around his moods without ever fully confronting the root causes that now seemed intertwined with financial desperation and hidden resentments. By the time we arrived at our apartment, the streetlights, casting elongated shadows across the parking lot that mirrored the elongated silences in our household, I had resolved to investigate further without tipping my hand. Starting the very next day during my lunch break at the office by accessing public records through the county clerk's online portal under the pretense of researching property values for a hypothetical home purchase, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I entered Dad's address and uncovered a trail of missed mortgage payments, extending back 4 months, not isolated incidents, but a consistent pattern linked to large cash withdrawals from his checking account that pointed unmistakably toward the riverboat casinos straddling the Ohio-Indiana border. Those glittering temptations where he and Uncle Mike would escape for what they called boys' weekends, but which now revealed themselves as reckless dives into slots and blackjack tables that eroded his nest egg faster than inflation chipped away at everyone's savings in this unforgiving post-recession economy. The discovery hit with a bitter irony, evoking memories of Dad's stern lectures during my teenage years about the perils of gambling away futures on foolish bets, while he himself had apparently been pulling the lever on one-armed bandits to numb the isolation of retirement. And as I sat staring at the screen in the dimly lit break room surrounded by the chatter of coworkers microwaving leftovers, a hollow laugh escaped me at the thought of him hunched over a machine nicknamed Lady Luck when his real fortune lay in the daughter he had so publicly dismissed, fueling a resolve to turn this knowledge into a measured form of accountability that would sting without shattering the fragile connections we still shared. That evening, after tucking Sarah in with a bedtime story about clever foxes outsmarting hunters that felt all too applicable to my scheming mindset, I delved deeper by calling an old acquaintance from high school who now worked in collections for a local finance firm, casually inquiring about general debt recovery practices, while steering the conversation toward hypothetical scenarios involving overdue mortgages tied to gaming habits. Her insights confirming that anonymous tips could trigger audits without immediate backlash to the informant, planting the seed for a revenge that would be both clever and contained as I envisioned Dad scrambling to explain his expenditures to probing eyes that might force him to confront the mess he had created long before the bank's calls became a daily ritual. The twist emerged unexpectedly the following afternoon when Sarah returned from school with a family history project that required digging into our genealogy. Pulling out the dusty photo albums stored in the hall closet where I had stashed them after Mom's passing to avoid the ache of reminiscence, and as we flipped through yellowed pages together, her small finger pointing out relatives I had forgotten or never known, we landed on a snapshot from my wedding day a decade earlier, the one where Dad had boycotted the ceremony over some trivial disagreement about my career choice in insurance rather than following his path into the factory. But scrawled in Mom's elegant script along the margin was a cryptic note about the sister's shadow from Robert's wild days, hinting at a half-sibling conceived during his bachelor years in the 70s and quietly placed for adoption without fanfare or follow-up, a revelation that twisted the knife of his hypocrisy deeper by suggesting he had judged my independence harshly while harboring his own unresolved paternal failures that could explain the jealousy Uncle Mike had hinted at during his confessional call. This newfound layer complicated my emotions, stirring a dilemma between empathy for a man burdened by secrets and the righteous anger that propelled me toward action, especially as the growing conflict manifested in a surprise visit from Uncle Mike later that week, bearing a pizza from our go-to spot with cheese that stretched like the thin excuses he offered while we ate at the kitchen table. his admissions flowing freer over second slices as he detailed how Dad's barbs in the video stemmed not just from pride, but from envy over my stable job supporting Sarah, without the safety net he had lost. The humor surfacing when he recounted Dad misplacing his wallet during a bingo night only to discover it tucked in his sock drawer the next morning, a tale that lightened the air momentarily but underscored the pathetic cycles of avoidance that had defined their brotherhood for decades. Bolstered by this intel yet wary of overstepping into outright cruelty, I executed my plan the next morning from a payphone at the gas station to maintain anonymity, dialing a debt collection agency with ties to the casino and providing just enough misdirection about Dad's supposed side income from selling vintage auto parts online to muddy their pursuit and buy him time for reflection, a witty deflection that would frustrate his creditors into endless loops of verification calls without directly implicating me, delivering a satisfying undercurrent of payback that aligned with the petty coffee spill from our last visit while preserving my position as the composed observer in our unfolding drama. Sarah sensed the shift in my demeanor during our evening routine of baking cookies for her class bake sale, flour dusting her cheeks as she quizzed me on Grandpa's well-being with the innocence that pierced through adult pretenses. And I deflected with a fabricated yarn about him challenging a crafty squirrel to a nut-hoarding contest, eliciting her giggles that temporarily eased the uncertainty gnawing at my resolve. But as the night deepened and I sorted through the day's mail under the glow of the lamp, a sharp knock at the door jolted me from my reverie, revealing Dad on the threshold with a scowl etched deep into his features under the harsh porch light, his voice low and accusatory as he demanded answers about the sudden inquiries into his credit history that had started flooding his inbox, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that suggested he suspected my involvement far more than he let on, dragging forth a personal betrayal from our shared past that shattered the remnants of my carefully constructed silence and propelled the confrontation into uncharted territory where revenge and revelation intertwined perilously close. Facing Dad on my doorstep that evening with his accusatory glare piercing through the gathering twilight like a spotlight on a suspect, I stepped aside instinctively to usher him into the living room where Sarah's toys lay scattered across the carpet in colorful disarray that suddenly seemed to amplify the chaos of our impending exchange. The air thick with the scent of the dinner I had abandoned on the stove as his presence filled the space with an urgency that demanded immediate reckoning for the anonymous probes I had set in motion against his financial secrets. He paced the worn area rug with purposeful strides that echoed his frustration, launching into a tirade about the invasion of his privacy by faceless creditors who had started hounding him with calls and letters questioning every expenditure from the past year, his voice rising in pitch as he connected the dots to my recent visit and the subtle questions I had posed about his retirement stability, forcing me to maintain a composed facade while inside my mind raced to deflect without outright lying about the role my clever tip had played in stirring the hornet's nest of his gambling debts. We eventually migrated to the kitchen table under the harsh fluorescence of the overhead light, where I poured us mugs of instant tea from the kettle that had whistled forgotten on the burner, the steam rising like unspoken tensions as he slumped into a chair and began unraveling the threads of his defenses, admitting through gritted teeth that the casino outings with Uncle Mike had spiraled from occasional distractions into a habit that chipped away at his savings after Mom's death left him adrift in a house full of memories and empty hours, his explanations laced with justifications about needing something to fill the void left by the factory layoffs that had stripped him of purpose decades earlier. The conversation deepened into raw territory when I countered with references to the video Uncle Mike had shared, describing how his laughter and those cutting words about my worthlessness had landed like blows from an old hammer he used to wield so confidently in the garage, prompting him to pause mid-sip and meet my eyes with a flicker of remorse that quickly hardened into defensiveness, revealing through halting admissions that his mockery stemmed from a deep-seated jealousy over the life I had carved out independently as a single mother with a reliable job and a daughter who looked to me for strength. Qualities he envied because they highlighted his own failures in providing the same security without resorting to the bottle or the betting tables that had become his crutches. Humor infiltrated the heaviness unexpectedly when he attempted to illustrate his point by fishing a so-called lucky poker chip from his shirt pocket. The cheap plastic disc slipping from his fingers and skittering across the floor to land squarely in Sarah's abandoned cereal bowl on the counter, the clatter drawing her in. From her room with wide-eyed curiosity that turned the moment into an absurd tableau of adult strife interrupted by childhood innocence, her giggles breaking the ice as Dad retrieved it with exaggerated grunts that coaxed reluctant chuckles from both of us. A brief respite that underscored the ridiculousness of holding grudges amid the everyday absurdities that bound families together despite their fractures. Yet the dilemmas mounted as he delved further into confessions. Touching on that shadowy note from Mom's handwriting in the wedding photo about the half-sibling he had fathered young and surrendered in silence to preserve the image of the steadfast provider he projected to the world. A choice that now haunted him with regrets over lost connections while fueling his resentment toward my perceived successes that mirrored what he might have built differently, leaving me torn between compassion for his vulnerabilities and the burning need to exact a payback that would expose those weaknesses without mercy. As he departed later with a heavy sigh and a promise to sort his affairs before they spiraled further, his truck's taillights fading down the street into the night that matched the uncertainty churning in my gut. I channeled the unresolved anger into action the very next morning by visiting the local post office during my lunch hour, where under the guise of a concerned relative updating contact information, I rerouted his incoming mail to a rented P.O. box under an innocuous alias that would delay his access to bills and statements for weeks, ensuring the bank's notices and casino dunning letters piled up unseen while he chased dead ends. A witty maneuver of bureaucratic sabotage that felt like elegant justice for the years he had dismissed my efforts as inadequate, satisfying the itch for revenge with its layers of deniability and the potential to force him toward self-reflection amid the growing isolation. Sarah picked up on my distracted air that weekend as we prepared batches of oatmeal cookies for her school's fundraiser, the kitchen counters dusted with flour and cinnamon that filled the air with warmth, contrasting the cool calculations in my mind. Her probing questions about Grandpa's recent visit drawing forth a light-hearted deflection about him wagering against a particularly sly backyard squirrel in a contest of wits that ended in a draw. Her laughter easing the momentary guilt that flickered at the edges of my resolve, but doing little to quell the impending storm as I imagined Dad's confusion mounting with each missed delivery. The tension escalated that Sunday evening during an impromptu family dinner I hosted to test the waters of tentative reconciliation, with Uncle Mike arriving bearing a six-pack of root beer as his peace offering and Dad showing up uncharacteristically early with a pie from the diner that tasted more of obligation than affection. The meal unfolding around plates of roast chicken and mashed potatoes that grew cold as accusations simmered beneath the surface pleasantries, until a phone call shattered the fragile truce just as dessert was served, the bank's representative on the line with Dad's device buzzing insistently on the table, their voice audible enough to convey threats of foreclosure proceedings set to begin in 30 days if the arrears weren't cleared immediately, leaving him pale and fumbling for excuses while the room fell into stunned silence, my position as the one with savings sufficient to intervene hanging over us like a sword of Damocles that forced me to weigh the cost of salvation against the satisfaction of letting him stew in the consequences of his own making. The dilemma crystallizing in that charged moment as Uncle Mike's eyes met mine with a plea that mirrored the unanswered questions swirling in my thoughts about whether extending help would heal the wounds or merely bandage them for another round of betrayals. The scam letter from Uncle Mike that buzzed onto my phone right after Dad's tense departure from the family dinner carried revelations that appended my carefully nurtured resentment like a sudden gust through an open window. Its faded lines in Mom's handwriting detailing how Robert had turned down a lucrative supervisory position at the auto plant back in the early 80s to stay home and care for me during her prolonged recovery from a car accident that had left her bedridden for months, sacrifice he had never mentioned in all our years of strained conversations because his pride framed it as just another unremarkable act of fatherhood rather than the profound choice that had derailed his own ambitions and perhaps planted the seeds of the bitterness he later directed at my perceived freedoms. Clutching the device in the dim light of the kitchen where the remnants of roast chicken congealed on plates around the table, I felt the weight of this new truth pressing against the revenges I had orchestrated, from the delayed check to the coffee-stained trophy and the anonymous creditor tips that had tangled his debts in bureaucratic knots. Each petty strike now appearing in a different light as responses to pain he had internalized without complaint, leaving me to question whether my path of subtle sabotage had been a necessary reckoning or merely a continuation of the very cycles of withholding that had defined our relationship since my teenage rebellions against his rigid expectations. The following afternoon, with the foreclosure notice's 30-day clock ticking louder in my mind like an alarm I could no longer ignore, I drove back to Dad's ranch house under a sky heavy with the promise of autumn rain that pattered against the windshield in erratic bursts, mirroring the turmoil in my thoughts. Arriving to find the front yard cluttered with half-packed boxes of garage tools and faded memorabilia that spoke to his reluctant preparations for potential upheaval. The air inside thick with the musty scent of cardboard and defeat as he shuffled about in a threadbare sweater, his usual bluster subdued into quiet grunts while sorting through stacks of mail that had finally caught up to him thanks to my rerouted deliveries now flooding the counter like an overdue tide. We settled on the porch steps overlooking the overgrown lawn where Sarah had once chased butterflies during summer visits, the wood creaking under our weight as I laid bare the full extent of my knowledge, from the mistaken video to the bank's insistent calls I had overheard, confessing the chain of revenges that had started with that spilled coffee and escalated to the mail diversions designed to mirror the emotional neglect I had felt from his dismissive words, watching his face contort through phases of shock and dawning realization that softened into a weary admission of his own faults, his voice cracking as he explained how the gambling had been a misguided attempt to recapture the control lost when he chose family over career advancement all those years ago. Humor emerged in the midst of the raw exchange when he pulled out a crumpled casino receipt from his pocket to illustrate a particularly foolish bet on a horse dubbed Harper's Last Stand that had instead finished dead last. His self-deprecating chuckle at the irony of naming his downfall after himself coaxing a reluctant smile from me that bridged the chasm momentarily, highlighting the absurd humanity in our shared flaws as father and daughter navigating the wreckage of unspoken sacrifices and retaliatory jabs. Yet the dilemmas intensified as his phone rang once more with the bank's final ultimatum, the representative's tone brooking no further extensions and outlining the auction process that would strip him of the home where we had weathered storms both literal and figurative, compelling me to slide my checkbook across the step with an offer to cover the arrears on the condition that he commit to counseling for the gambling and open up about the half-sibling shadow from his past, a stipulation that made him hesitate with pride flaring in his eyes like the dying embers of the fire pit from that fateful video. But the letter's exposure of his long-buried generosities tipped the scale, leading him to nod in reluctant agreement as tears he quickly wiped away betrayed the vulnerability he had armored against for decades. Uncle Mike arrived shortly thereafter with Sarah in tow, the impromptu intervention unfolding around the kitchen table laden with takeout pizza boxes that served as neutral ground for hashing out the layers of betrayal and payback. From his intentional video leak to forced dialogue to my witty mail reroute that had exposed the vulnerabilities he had hidden behind bluster, the confessions weaving a tapestry of partial redemptions where Dad signed the counseling referral form with a hand steadier than I expected, his gaze meeting mine with a mix of gratitude and lingering wariness that suggested the wounds ran too deep for a single evening's truce. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in twilight hues that blurred the edges of resolution, I gathered Sarah for the drive home with her chattering about Grandpa's funny stories to fill the quiet stretches of road, the ambiguity of our progress settling over me like the cooling night air seeping through the cracked window, prompting reflections on whether my silences and strikes had liberated us from the toxic patterns or merely reshaped them into something more insidious. Leaving the true measure of healing unanswered as I pondered if extending that final check had been an act of forgiveness or just another calculated move in a game where no one truly won. The questions lingering like echoes in the empty spaces between us long after the engine's hum faded into the distance.